Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kristina Peralta. I graduated class of 2010 in the School of Education with a degree in Policy, Organization, and Leadership Studies. And it's so funny because Anthony was actually my advisor while I was a student, so it's a reunion. So shall we go into the first question, or shall we have each of our panelists kind of talk a little bit more about their work?
Yeah, I think everyone should introduce themselves.
All right, so let's start over here with Kyle.
Hi, everyone. Kyle Abraham, a senior majoring in Asian American Studies, actually the Asian American Studies major of Stanford. Last people who graduated with that were 13, there's no one 14, I'm in the class of 15. There's no one declared in 16, 17, 18.
Not yet.
Not yet. So yeah. I mean, I'm not a professor, so I don't have like much work or anything. But broadly, I've been with the relationship with Anthony when I took his class. My freshman spring, just an East House seminar on race and higher education, Asian American perspective, and from then, kind of my interests have spanned from like admissions to the student experience, college experiences, student affairs, higher education, Asians in Asia, as opposed to Asians in America, and then, so yeah, that's kind of.
So I'll just say a little bit in form of introduction. We have some questions to go through. So my name's Anthony Lising, Antonio. I always put the Lising in the middle so people can figure out my first name from my last name. I've been at Stanford for 17 years now, which is freaky to say, in the School of Education. This is my second year chairing Asian American Studies, although Asian American Studies has now had quite a history. I'll say a little bit more about that. I think I'm going to stop there because I have more to say about the program, the history, and mostly about where the future may lie and the role that all of you have in that.
My name is Murphy-Shigematsu. I first taught in Asian American Studies about 2003. And I was so discouraged by the experience that I didn't teach again until 2008. I said, where's all the students? You know, there's so many Asian American students on this campus, and yet there's so few in the class. But I did start again in about 2008, and even then I started in Asian American Studies, and most of my students were African Americans, so I changed the course completely and I moved it into what's called CSRE, right? And then I came back again to teach this winter in Asian American Studies. So I have taught on and off over the years, but consistently in CSRE. And
what are some of the milestones?
So I'll say a little bit about that. May here.
yeah.
So May is over there. Quite arguably, without May Lee, there would be no Asian American Studies at Stanford. So she should. She's not on this panel, but she sort of is the foundation to this panel. So some of you might have heard about the takeover of the president's office 25 years ago. Bailey was part of that, we call it a cabal. And this was all in response to and around the time of a lot of diversity issues on campus. There was a big report, there was a committee called the Undergraduate Committee on Minority Issues at CMI that put out this big report. And there were a lot of demands, and some of those demands had to do with ethnic studies. And there was no real action until this takeover of the president's office. That was 89, 90. And because of that, that was the momentum for what eventually became CSRE, and Asian American Studies major, along with Native American Studies, Latino Studies, first two faculty hired for that were David Palumaliu in comparative literature. He teaches the Asian American culture community class, which is kind of the gateway class. If you haven't taken it, you should. And Gordon Chang in history, and some of you might have taken some of his classes. And those two have been the stalwarts of the program. So basically, since CSOE started and the major started, Chair of Asian American Studies has been Gordon or David, and Gordon and David, and Gordon and David. In the late 90s, the mid to late 90s, I think Asian American Studies was at its strongest. We had two great faculty members in anthropology, Primo Mankekar and Nikhil Gupta. They're very active in the program. Sylvia Yamagasako was fairly active in the program. So we had a lot of courses and majors. Nikhil Gupta and Primo Mankekar left for UCLA. They were kind of pushed out. This is a larger issue around promotion and tenure. And I think it's safe to say that Asian American Studies hadn't recovered well since then. But despite that, the CSRE has been very, very healthy. So we have about, anywhere from, it fluctuates, but anywhere from 20 to 30 or 30 plus majors in all of CSRE. That includes those different groups as well as a comparative major. In Asian American Studies fluctuates, so we have one this year. I think the peak would be like 7 or 8, something like that. But a lot of students that are interested in Asian American Studies will major in comparative studies as their major as well. So I began chairing a couple of years ago, and I think it represents a change in part because, one, I wasn't hired to do Asian American Studies. I was hired in the Graduate School of Education. While Gordon and David, aren't this close to retirement, they are fairly senior, and I think we're in a moment of what could be some exciting transitions with the program. And maybe I'll say what I think that means about Asian American Studies. But one other thing I want to add is say it's a little bit something about Stephen Murphy-Shigematsu. So apart from David and Gordon, the other stalwarts, the constant presence in Asian American Studies, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years now, has been Stephen. Stephen teaches 2 courses or more sometimes in Asian American Studies and CSRE. He directs the journal, Stanford Journal of Asian American Studies. He's constantly on campus and working with students, in addition to keeping up with his writing. And his writing is squarely in Asian American Studies as well. So a lot of the vitality of the program as it is currently configured is due to Stephen's commitment and his efforts there. So I'm going to stop there.
Sure.
Additional questions?
No, that was really great. Thanks for the historical context also. I know that you mentioned that this year there's currently one person that we have on our panel.
He has a name.
His name is Kyle. That's majoring in Asian American Studies. So numbers kind of pose a challenge. Could you talk a little bit more about challenges that you face, but also kind of areas for opportunity?
So I've been talking a lot. So maybe Kyle, you can talk about, let's start from the student perspective of how you came to Asian American Studies and to major in it, and what were any challenges along the way, questioning whether you should or shouldn't or should.
I'll try to get this. It's kind of a long story. But basically, like most Stanford students, you come in, you feel like you're a mistake, you didn't belong. And I was just like, there's so many much more smarter Asians. So I'm going to go look at the admissions process. So I did my power papers and stuff like that. History of higher ed, David Lever as a freshman, which is not necessarily recommended. But basically, I ended up in his class, East Class on Spring Race and Higher Education, Asian and American Perspective. And basically, through that class, I've been able to explore a lot of different things. I asked him at the end, like, oh, are there any research opportunities in like Asian or American stuff in education? There were none at the time. Midsummer, he calls me up. There's something. He gives me something. I'm reading through stuff. All of a sudden, it's all in preparation for conference to Hawaii. He basically asked me if I want to go, and I'm like, duh. And then I end up being kind of there. This is into my sophomore year, and it was kind of just like, oh, you know, Anthony just sort of took a chance on me. I don't know why. But like, yeah, he didn't expose me to a lot of things. And it was just like, you're like, oh, this is actually something. And honestly, him being there is like, oh, he's Filipino. Well, that's like cool. So having a person of faculty that's of a similar background, honestly, is also very important. That December break, I remember asking my mom, like, is it okay if I major in Asian American Studies? And then her response was, while ironing clothes. Yeah. And then it was just like, and then I left the room. And then I went, a few hours later, I came back. I'm like, Mom, are you sure you're okay with majoring in Asian American Studies? And she's just like, yeah. I mean, it's Stanford, right? I was like, this is terrible. In my mind, of course, and then I just took it again. So after that, yeah, that was kind of my decision. Was like, oh, I at least have permission now to go do Asian American Studies. And you know, sort of the challenges as from a student, like the classes always change every year generally, or like they're not always consistent. So even if like DPL's Asian American Cultures Communities class, I've been in this class through 3 different iterations as a student and as like a TA. And then it's always like changing, the time is offered and constantly improving. So that's the good and bad thing about prototyping things. But the thing is, there's nothing really constant there for students to like plan like ahead. So most of the time people will prioritize, you know, like, oh, I'm like Kenny, I'm gonna go do that. And then like if I can't fit Asian American Studies or something, do that. So there's still, you know, pressure from the parents, you know, pressure from the STEM community in Silicon Valley to do all of that stuff. You know, other issues too, I feel like for me, like trying to recruit people into like Asian American Studies, I'm not the type of person where like, yeah, you should totally major in Asian American Studies, like I do this, and this, stuff like that. Like really bringing people in, because I like how I just fell into it, and like just, you know, navigating my own way and discovering that, which doesn't mean I'm gonna reach out to a lot of so many people, necessarily. But at the same time, for me, like I want to just share people organically and naturally how I came to this major and how meaningful and personal it has been to me. So in terms of like outreach and like, things like that, there are issues there. On the bright side, as you know, the only one, like I get all the FaceTime. People were asking me like, oh, sir, only one that class? No, I take other things. But also because of my interest in education, I will normally take classes in the School of Education, and I still haven't figured out my major plan because I have to talk to Anthony which classes can be approved from my major by the end of this quarter. So, yeah.
And Stephen, maybe you could talk from a faculty perspective about challenges and any kind of areas of opportunity.
Maybe why you left away and came back. What did you see?
Oh, I originally took Asian American Studies when I was a student at Harvard, and so I had the East Coast Asian American Studies experience, which with Peter Kiang was part of that group, and so it was very a formative thing for me as a student to take it, and so after that I ended up going to Japan. I lived in Japan for 20 years, so I was not directly involved with Asian American Studies, but when I came back, that was the first thing, so I wanted to really teach in that. But I was discouraged, like I said, by the lack of response by students. And so I didn't do it for a number of years, but then I went through this kind of self-evaluation of what is really important to me, and I decided I really wanted to try it again. So I approached Gordon, and I said, I'd like to teach again. And also, Gordon had started a journal called the Stanford Journal of Asian American Studies, but it had only one article in it. And so I looked at that and I said, we could make a real journal out of this too, and I'd be happy to be the editor of the journal. And so we started that too. And it seemed like there was possibly some momentum to what was going on. But we had a town hall meeting. Was that 2 years ago now? That we had some of you were here, I think, at the town hall meeting. Anybody was at that town hall meeting in CSRE building? No? Okay. Well, what I felt, it was quite a large group, and we had people Skyping in as well. And it felt like there was a lot of energy in the room, a lot of interested people to know what can we do with Asian American Studies. And Gordon and David were there, and I felt they were giving a very strong message that they had carried the banner for years and years, and that they could no longer contribute at that same level anymore. And now what are we going to do? And it seemed like that was a real transition moment, and that we still haven't really moved forward that much from that point. But I thought there were a lot of people saying that, David and Gordon were saying that we have tried this strategy too of trying to get a full-time faculty for years and years, and we have not been successful at it. And I felt like there were other people were saying, well, what else can we do? Is there another approach, and can we, but there were no clear answers. And I think we're still at that point of wondering what other options exist. Is it possible, to get more part-time lecturers? Is it possible to, in the same way that I get an honorarium for editing the journal? Somebody part-time can do certain kinds of work at a fairly low budget. Is it possible to get even that small budget? And it hasn't been for the past couple of years, but maybe to push in different directions, at least for a temporary solution, before we can get a more long-term solution of a real permanent faculty. And the issue that is our catch-22 is that we need to demonstrate that there's student interest by the enrollment in the courses, so that we can get more courses, and that way people who want to take the major will say we have enough courses to take the major, but without a number of courses, we have people we had a student, Tenzin Solomon was a major a couple of years ago, and then she said there weren't enough courses, so she began a CSRE major. So we've had a number of students, I think, like that if we could offer more courses, there would be a more attractive program. We could then make a stronger appeal to get some more resources for the program. But so we're kind of in that I think that catch-22 of knowing how can we get more courses and more students.
So, let's see. So what could the community then do to help support Asian American studies?
Well, I want to put this in sort of in a larger context. So, in a couple of ways. So when CSRE started, it was envisioned and touted as the new way to do ethnic studies, right? So ethnic studies, as most of you know, sort of was birthed in the 60s out of civil rights movements, right? Close connections to communities, community empowerment. It was an applied kind of scholarship in that kind of way. It was an empowering scholarship for those communities. And what resulted was African American studies, Asian American studies, Native American studies, Chicano studies, separate entities, if you will. And CSRE at Stanford, which you might think of as like the second wave, or maybe the second and a half wave of ethnic studies, had a different vision to it. And at its heart, the vision was comparative, right? So for the first time, someone could major in what's called comparative studies of race and ethnicity, right? Comparative ethnic studies. And that by far has been the largest major since the inception of CSRE. So the thinking back then was that's the direction that the interest is moving, that the scholarship is moving, is that it would be comparative. Now, 20 odd years later, at CSRE, we're wondering, we're thinking about, is there another transition afoot, right? Trying to imagine what that looks like, trying to look into the future by looking at young scholars that are doing what we might vaguely recognize as ethnic studies and asking the question, is there a new sort of movement afoot? And so we're having these conversations. What are we seeing? We're seeing a lot of, so while ethnic studies, you might conceive of as multidisciplinary, right? So if you're interested in, let's just say you're interested in Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, you might be very interested in identity, how the culture conceives of and crafts identities, how they interact with individuals, and how we understand that by reading literature, right? And I think that's a common understanding of what some ethnic studies might look like. And that would be a humanities person would do that kind of work, right? You might also be interested in the disparities that we see within and among between Asian American groups with regard to poverty or educational attainment, or you might be interested in segregated communities. From that lens, you might be thinking about it as a sociologist, let's say, right? You might be thinking about political movements, voting behavior. And so as a political scientist, you would be a political scientist in Asian American studies. So you have this multidisciplinary kind of approach. And what we're seeing now is more interdisciplinary. We might think of Asian American studies or ethnic studies as interdisciplinary, but in fact it's been multidisciplinary, right? So Gordon was trained as an historian, and David was trained as a comparative literature person. Sylvia Yamasako was trained as an anthropologist. But now we're seeing folks that, for example, might study health, race, and the environment all together, right? And so this person might have a background in public health while also being, let's say, a medical anthropologist, right? Where do you put those kinds of folks? Do you put them in a medical school or put them in an anthropology department? When they sort of integrate those things and study race and ethnicity and integration, the intersections of that, ethnic studies is that place, or could be that place, right? And so we're starting to see things like that. We just hired someone who has a joint appointment in the medical school and in English. And he has a background in public health. He has an MD, a PhD. He's pretty remarkable. And that's a person that fits in many places, but whose work fits in what you might think of as the new ethnic studies. Right? So that might be where you're going. That raises the question then, what about the structure of these existing majors? Do they still make sense? And so we're asking that question, and then we're asking as well, what is Stanford's place in developing this emerging kind of field? And clearly that the answer to that question is a number of years down the road, structurally thinking about the majors and the viability is still part of that. So for example, Asian American Studies has a huge professional field and community out there. There's, the Association for Asian American Studies, professional membership, professional field, have annual conferences and meetings. And so folks that study Asian American Studies who might major in that have the community that's there. So it wouldn't make sense to just throw that away, right? So we're having those conversations, trying to understand that. And this coincides, I think, as Kristina was saying, with a time when David Pombaliu and Gordon Chang are rolling off a bit in terms of their involvement in Asian American studies, which opens up some opportunity for new folks to step in. So the last 2 years, we've been looking around the country and trying to find Asian Americanists that can come to Stanford that can revitalize the program. And we're thinking about in what kinds of ways. So that's kind of where we are. So it's a place, it's kind of at an inflection point, right? Where there's opportunity down the road, but in somewhat of a precarious place right now, where the momentum of the program is really, being held together by David and Gordon's efforts, and certainly by Stephen's efforts. Now, the other layer of context I want to put on here is Stanford, right? So, what's the most popular major on campus?
CS.
CS, right? For the first time in the history of Stanford, CS is the most popular major. So Asian American Studies is in the same boat as classics or Portuguese or Spanish, or even many of the humanities and sciences majors. So what we're also thinking about in CSRE, as well as the smaller departments, is how these majors intersect with other kinds of majors, in particular CS, right? And CS is really open to this, and they're developing these joint programs. The most prominent of which is, I think, English. And so we have to think about the interests of Stanford students who are coming here in particular kinds of interests, and think about how that may pave the way for a new kind of ethnic studies, a new kind of Asian American studies. I think the status of Asian American studies is sort of on the precipice of some change that will emerge. And then the last thing that was on my mind that I want to say about this is that I think the future of Asian American studies, the reason I pointed to all of you in my initial remarks, is that the students on this campus that are most interested in Asian American studies are Southeast Asian Americans and Filipinos. The East Asian students have, for the most part, moved on, metaphorically, from Asian American studies, and the core of the interest is in this room and in the Southeast Asian communities. So I think the future, at least on this campus, is going to be
I want to go back to Kyle again, and you said that when you approached your mother about majoring in Asian American studies, you were already anticipating that there would be hesitation. So could you talk a little bit more about that? And then could you talk a little bit more about kind of what's been rewarding for you personally majoring in this, and kind of what you would say to encourage your peers to major in this?
There's a lot of questions.
Sorry. It's like 5 questions. So talk about kind of your mother's hesitance, and then kind of how you would encourage your peers to
I mean, like, for some people, I'm from San Jose, so like the mom was like, oh, your son's going to be going to Stanford. Are you going to become a doctor? No. Lawyer? No. So there's like pressure from like her peers in the community as like the token like child or family person for you to go and you need to do something that's going to make a lot of money or make a huge impact. My high school is involved in my high school's teaching time, so education has always been there. She knows I have a heart for it. But even when like going to college, she's like, oh, maybe you can double major in political science or business school, and like you're really good at like math and science, and like I'm just like, yeah. So like even then, like even though she'll like go back and forth, there is pressure from her expectations, like growing up, as an immigrant and like, whatever success, and then even whoever she's surrounded with, and she's kind of putting that onto me. And it was only been like since coming to Stanford. I lived in Okada as a freshman, so it was really fortunate that I got to talk to even Tina Guan, who was my ETA on the third floor, and also an Asian American Studies major to just talk about different things. So yeah, I just knew she was always going to push something because she was a pusher. But still, even senior year, she's like, "Oh, can't she go? Didn't you want to run for school board or something?" And she's like, "Yeah, maybe someday." Politics. But like, yeah, so there's always something about that she still hasn't come to accept, and I think that's the difficult thing too, because sometimes, like now that I've sort of decided, like, you know, you're going to college, you're making your own path and everything, and sometimes as much as like you care about what your parents think and honoring them and things like that, you know, I had to come to the realization and also the decision that like I need to also be my own person and start doing that. So breaking away from that for each someone that's individually is going to be difficult. And it might not happen in college, it might happen later or something. But I can kind of run back and forth. And then, so the second question
It's about encouraging.
Encouraging?
This room who maybe might be in a position where they're looking to determine what major they want to pursue. What would you tell them?
I mean, even though it's supposed to be directed toward like majoring in Asian American studies, and like I admit, like, yeah, I want people to like join with me too, but like I also want to make sure that you guys, whoever it is, has a compelling reason to join. That makes sense to you. For me, honestly, like in part, like I majored in Asian American studies because of Anthony, because I took his class. I asked, you know, I was a research position or something, and then he thought of me. There's just someone out there that gave me an opportunity, took a chance on me, and it's opened up a lot of doors and opportunities for me, regardless of wherever I go. And he's always like been there. And to know that, like, you know, I major in that, I like have a story and like, oh, I go to Hawaii, which is like, you know, people and everything. But at the same time, like for me, like I tell people, like I can whine and cry and like go to and things like that. Even though, you know, he doesn't talk much whenever you're with him individually, but like him being here, honestly, like is probably the main reason why. And I just do that by sharing my story and the things that I've been able to do. And so whether regardless of like CSU or whatever's that you're doing, you know, for me and like my parents and like all those like other things of like maybe how to like tell people, like I just want to be honest with myself and with you that like I chose this because of this random path where someone took a chance on me, someone continues to believe in me and continues to support me even the times when I like are super like falling everything. And I actually didn't anticipate saying this at anything. But like honestly, that is a testament to like what it means to me personally, and it's not something that I'm gonna say is gonna happen for each and every one of you if you were to major in it, but there is something there, and I want that moment of self-discovery for you to forge it on, to realizing how meaningful and personal something can be to you. So I don't necessarily go out there and say like, oh, totally major in Asian American Studies. Let me get to know you. Let me know what you want to do, and let me see how like Asian American Studies perhaps can fit in, and then just try it out. Because I'm not gonna. No one here is gonna tell you like, oh, you're gonna like do that. That's gonna be great, and then be potentially like disappointed or something. And the way like people like mention me, things like that, just like finding them and things like that, you were just kind of like, okay, let's do that, but let's try to just see what Asian American Studies can also do for you in that sense. And if it's not, that's completely fine for me, but at least I could try that there was an interest in something out there. But how to have those conversations on a large scale level is like, yeah, difficult. So, yes. And thank you.
So before we open it up for questions, I had one more question to the two faculty on our panel, and that's this idea of like having Asian American studies being more interdisciplinary. I just got off of a great panel with the arts, and Nakia was on that panel, and she said that she has this artistic side of her, but she was also trained as an engineer, and how those two things kind of have meshed for her. And you mentioned making Asian American studies more appealing to folks that are really interested in computer science. So could you talk a little bit more your ideas behind that? Where those two seemingly disparate areas kind of merge?
So I don't have a lot of formed ideas. It's kind of observing what's happening out there. And I mean, I think it goes back to the way that a lot of it has a social science base to it. It's the way that we look at the world and the way that we essentially problem solve. And the way that we problem solve in the world has honestly, and here I'm sort of paying homage to my engineering background, has taken an engineering kind of approach. What I mean by that is by, let's say we're identifying big problems like feeding the world, like saving the planet. Let's take local problems, like poverty and its effects in our urban areas, things like that. The way that we think about those, the way that we conceptualize them, the way that we address them can no longer be from singular perspectives. And from a problem-solving perspective, it requires folks to partner with different-minded people. And in academy, different-minded people mean people from different disciplines, right? So if we go and look at underprivileged youth and their relationship to schools and their communities, perhaps it makes sense to try to understand what's going on, not only from the lens of a sociologist, but the lens of artists, of community activists, in cooperation. And that's this multidisciplinary, or this interdisciplinary approach and flavor. So I think the more that we begin to see that bubble up into the university, the more that has the potential to sort of vitalize and change ethnic studies. So we already see this in other places. We have an entire building, like Clark, right? It's the IOX building, which is at its core interdisciplinary kind of center. I think that's very much going to be sort of a Stanford way of doing things. And it could and should happen in Asian American studies.
I think for me, it's always, I was trained in a very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary department at Harvard, and although I ended up being a clinical psychologist, that was simply the basis for my other work, which was in a lot of, I worked in the Black community in Boston and then in San Francisco, in the Asian American community in San Francisco, in the Richmond area. But for me, it's always been a very, my own studies have been very multidisciplinary, and I think so I see it in many different ways. One, I also did research throughout Asia and tried to connect Asian studies with Asian American studies, and certainly that was something that when Asian American studies started, it was considered to be, you didn't go there because people were trying to distinguish themselves from Asian studies, and so even if you, at that time, if you knew an Asian language, it was considered almost irrelevant. It's like we're supposed to be American, and it's supposed to be really American studies. And I think now that people realize that to really understand an issue, certainly related to Filipinos, the transnational aspect is so important. You have to understand that it's not simply a one-way migration, but that the transnational emphasis has to always be there. So that's one way of connecting Asian American studies. I worked for several years in the medical school and trying to connect this whole field of what they're called cultural competence. Asian American studies was extremely useful there in understanding what are the needs of different patient populations in an area like California or any place, a major city in which you have all these people who are some immigrants or children of immigrants and have a particular way of understanding illness and healing. And so for that, Asian American Studies was really useful. And you said Tina Duong was a Asian American Studies major?
Yeah, she was double majored in bio.
In bio. And she's in medical school now. And so you can see even when you marry Asian American Studies major, it can still have a great deal of application to practical fields. And in this area, like the class that's being offered right now, Asian American leadership, is extremely relevant to this area of the country now in Silicon Valley, in which you have this huge number of Asian workers who are confronting that glass ceiling, the bamboo ceiling, the ceiling at which they can enter but are not considered to be leaders. And so looking at that whole understanding these in many different aspects of is necessary for dealing with an issue like that. You probably have more questions.
Sure. We actually wanted to open this up to the audience, so if you guys have any other questions.
I was wondering whether this, your studies, or what's going on at Stanford with regards to CSR, reflects an overall national trend that you see going on, or whether this is unique to Stanford, or what the experience was like, how that relates to experience at Harvard, either back then or back now. But is Stanford's experience following the general Asian American Studies trend, if there is one on the national level?
I'll just say one word about that. I think the transnational trend is something that's been alive for a few years now, and that's very much a focus of Asian American Studies, that moving in that direction. And an area I focus on in particular is mixed race, and so that's also something that is because of the increased population of mixed race Asian Americans. That's also a topic that is quite popular in different places.
I think as far as the interdisciplinary, the true interdisciplinary nature, that's still very nascent, and is something that that Stanford as a whole has been nurturing, across the campus, and if it takes hold in the ethnic studies world. I think it'll be led in places like Stanford. Stanford is very unique in the area of ethnic studies, not only because it was founded much later, but just because of the constellation of folks that are here. So it's quite interesting that David and Alvaro and others have been going back and forth to the East Coast this past year, because they want to understand how we are doing things here. That there's movements in these other private universities of what we might think of as a third wave, and they're looking to us for guidance on how to do that. So I think there is a future that will be of a slightly different constellation, and a lot of that might start here.
One thing that we're involved in, Anthony and myself, is there was April 4th was the anniversary of what's called the Riverside, a speech at the Riverside Church by Martin Luther King Jr., in which he spoke out against the Vietnam War. And he was prompted to do that by Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And so that event is something that I teach a lot in my classes, because it represents this way of bringing together different fields, different movements, how that was a unity of civil rights movement, Black Power movement, with the anti-Vietnam War movement, and it also united people who were seen as having their own issues, and suddenly said we have to unite issues that apply to the suffering of all people. And so that, to me, also represents something that the unity of what's called contemplative education now and transformative education. So contemplative, meaning the whole area of whole student development, trying to use bring spirituality into even social justice movements. And so that people like Thich Nhat Hanh or Martin Luther King Jr. or Grace Lee Boggs, who talk about spirituality and how the need to address how our spiritual development and development as individuals relates directly to our actions as social activists in terms of how we act with for social justice. And so in the course I'm offering right now in Asian American Studies, it's trying to bring together those two fields of study. And Anthony and I are involved in a wider university initiative to have these courses brought more into the university.
So I saw Julian's hand first and then Robert.
Yeah, because I just think it was interesting what Anthony was talking about how a lot of the core people that are interested in Asian American studies are in Southeast Asian groups, and a lot of these Southeast Asian groups also have very thriving and vibrant student group like PASU, like what we're seeing here. So I know that, I mean, there's been a lot of student initiatives to kind of study their own history, study their own communities that within the Filipino American student undergrad community, there's been an alternative spring break that has stopped taking students to outside the community to learn about the Filipino community, to learn about the history. So I guess I'm just wondering a little bit more about knowing that there are these efforts here, but also knowing that I was a history major too, knowing that there's only one Asian American studies major right now. Like what is the role of student groups, like organized student groups like PASU, to really ensure that Asian American studies is thriving? Also, what is the role of Asian American studies to ensure that that the students can feel supported in pursuing these kind of studies about their own communities?
I think if you go back to the role of students in the first wave of programs in the late 60s, and then Stanford like in the second wave programs, it's really about communicating to administrators the need and the demand for courses that are relevant to your education. And then following up on that by taking those courses. It's no surprise that ethnic studies was born out of activist students, and that will carry the day here as well. I think it's no surprise that, as you mentioned, Southeast Asian communities and Filipino American community have strong activist pieces within them that I think can help drive that kind of interest. So in fact, you're looking at, let's say it's a petition or something like that, there's 30 students that want this kind of class and another 40 that want this kind of class. That's more than compelling to move us to action to do something. At the end of the day, there has to be a dean or somebody that sort of puts the money down for it, and we want to be able to come to them and say, well, look, if you build it, they'll come. So it does go back to organizing.
Maybe this is just an observation, but years ago I was asked to fill out a form that says race. And so there's a list of races in there. There's Asia, Asian, Pacific Islander. Well, the Philippines is a Pacific Island, so I'm a Pacific Islander. I'm not Asian. But when you say Asian American Studies, I know now it includes Filipino Americans, right? And if it does, then I hope it also includes the very first Filipinos who came to America, who landed in New Orleans. You hear that story? And the ones that landed in Morro Bay. And also the first wave Filipinos who came before prior to the Titans of the Act of 1934. That's just my observation. That settles my split personality, I guess, because I always consider myself a Pacific Islander, not Asian. So when you say Asian American Studies, inside it says it doesn't include Filipinos. So that's just my observation.
It looks like we're just right about out of time, but are there any closing statements that you want?
I just maybe respond to
Sure.
Julian's. To me, this type of event is extremely important, that Asian American Studies is part of this type of event. And I think that, like Tuesday, I was involved in an event that was students in Asian American Studies co-sponsored it. And then Wednesday I was involved with another event, and it was connected to both the Palo Alto Children's Theater, but also on campus we had the Stanford Taiko sponsoring it, and the Japanese Student Union, and Asian American Studies co-sponsored that as well. And to me, all these things are something that it's really important to keep building this kind of network and show that Asian American Studies is connected to all the activities that are going on, that the student groups are organizing, that we support the groups, and that we also show that the studies are directly connected to the kinds of activities that you're doing. So I think it's really good that we're here.
And just a quick add, I mean, a lot of the times, like, as the only Asian American Studies major, we talk about, like, what a PASU and these things, how they're so important, but honestly, y'all don't take the class. Like, that's straight up. Y'all aren't gonna major in it. You have to realize the implications. You need to take that class so other people can see. You need to major in Asian American Studies if you want Asian American Studies, not CSR. So my way of also contributing to the way that why I also choose to major in Asian American Studies is because of when we reach out into all these other communities, what I like is that you go and do all these things, but I'm also doing it for you guys. And you guys sometimes joke about how, like, oh, is it like lonely or something, like, and you're telling me you go to these events? Why don't y'all take class then? This isn't supposed to be like something like, but like true, like, you're interested, you talk about how these matter and things like this, take these classes. There are structural systems that you need to jump through for you to be heard and to be noticed. And so I strongly encourage you, if you're an underclassman, tell them, just take an Asian American Studies class, and then you can specify in your final project and paper and do the Filipino experience like I do.
So I think just to wrap up, I could talk a little bit. No, this was great. And to build off of what you were saying, just as full disclosure, I actually minored in Asian American Studies, not here, but at Davis, and there were a bunch of us there. But somebody that I really looked up to, who I see as a mentor, is Bill Hing, and he actually taught at the law school, but he did a lot of work on Asian American experiences within the immigration system. So I know that you're a senior, but I mean, 10 years after graduating from Davis, looking back, I mean, I think it's been really meaningful to me. One of my first jobs after graduation and before I came to Stanford was working at the Asian Law Caucus. And then nobody was doing anything really around immigration reform and the Asian community. And I think what was really helpful to me was to have that background and to look at kind of what other communities were doing early on in the kind of the movement as we were creating Aspire, which is a group dedicated solely for Asian American and Pacific Islander Dream Act students, was looking at what the Latino community was doing around organizing. And I think if I didn't have that kind of framework, looking at what organizing looked like and what organizing could look like now, you know, Aspire would have never happened. So I think it's also important to know that our history is also dynamic, it's changing. Nobody was really doing anything around immigration reform and the API community 10 years ago, but there are so many people doing it now. I tend to ramble on. So if anybody else wants to give a better closing than I'm currently doing, I just wanted to thank everybody for their participation. So go ahead, Shimon.
Maybe just maybe one thing that came to mind during this discussion, but I think really having this kind of discussion here where, you know, Kyle laid it out that there's this thing where people need to be able to take the classes, but I think what this panel has really given us the opportunity to really think about that, how do you really move that forward, so knowing that we don't really get to, the Asian American Studies Department doesn't really get to interact with all of the students, right? So how can we use this opportunity right now to really bring the students together with the Asian American Studies faculty and really discuss what is it that we can do to make sure that the classes that are offered are classes that people will feel committed to. You know, there has been a steady flow of people that are taking what is it that's attracting you to that, and how can you also talk about like how can we do this together and really show that there's a strong, strong union between Asian American studies and those students.
I mean, one class in particular is David Colonial's Asian American Culture and Community, which is the foundational class. The three teaching assistants are myself, Catherine, myself, and Samuel Wills. We're all working specifically with Asian American specific communities. Samuel Wills is working with API equality in Northern California with LGBTQ and recurring oral issues and narratives. Catherine's group is working with Paulis. My group is working with my high school in Independent San Jose with my large Asian. So there are ways, and I've sort of pulled Catherine and pulled Sandy, and you have the three Filipinos that are even doing that class. So when you're bridging those things, it's the stuff that we've been doing as student groups, but we're sort of also being able to legitimize it in the actual class. So from a practical standpoint, Catherine and I are graduating now. 2 people need to replace us. We're going to find people. So if you want to do something, do it. We just refer you. And David has been very open-ended, and there's these different things that you can jump through, like hoops to bend over backwards to legitimize. A lot of the times I feel like we're trying to legitimize and justify the stuff we do in student groups to important people. Well, how do you do that? Do it in the classroom. Take the class. Lead the class. And this is what I share. So when I've gone to PASU meetings, yeah, you should take this class, and no one ever really does, how does that make me feel? And then your commitment to whatever this is. Are you committed to actually making through it from the current processes that are happening too? Not to say that I'm putting the blame on anything, but that's just honestly how I've also been feeling too, because there are opportunities, I've told you, and even though I'm not the faculty at admission registrations, I just also feel well, it seems like y'all aren't going to try to do stuff either. But there are 2 right there.
I think we're going to end on Kyle's call to action. So,